Well, good afternoon. Looks like people are logging in, and that is good news. Um, Obviously, we'll get to a point at the end where you can ask questions, so you're going to want to make sure that you have your phone controls configured correctly so that I see most of you are on mute right now, but I just want to remind you at the end, you're going to want to be able to unmute so that you can ask questions. And yeah, I think looks like you can see my screen. That's right. Okay, so I think we're ready to get started. So with that, many of you have been in some of the presentations I've given before about presentations, and so part of my effort is to continually introduce the core material in slightly different ways each time. Mostly because I don't want you to get bored, but at the same time, you'll some of this stuff is going to sound remarkably familiar if you've been in some of my other sessions, because it's just core. We got to get it right, and the more you hear it and the more you practice it, the better you become when you're presenting. So with that, I just want us to go straight into it because I know we're going to be tight for time. Here's the thing. You're all going to be presenting technical content. One way or another, you're going to be presenting technical content to an audience that is either somewhat technical or completely technical or simply managing a technical product. And so in every one of those cases, it's easy to get yourself bogged down into a lot of the techno speak or the specifics of click this screen, click this button, click this thing. And in the midst of that, you'll lose your audience. And that takes us to literally the very first point that I want to make, and that is that you need to be really aware that in general people are going to, sorry, let me get you there. Let's make sure that you get the right screen. That's right. You need to be aware that people are going to forget about 90% of what they hear from you in that hour that you're presenting. 90% of what we hear, we lose in a month. And most of us lose it literally within the first 60 minutes. So that means if we're sitting in a room talking, if I share some insight with you and you're gone, you go to the next class and you go to the next one after that, because obviously at this, at this conference, that's exactly what's going to happen. People are going to go from one session to another. And if you ask them, hey, what was the session at 10 a.m. about? It's likely they may not remember anything. But they may remember, and the hope is that they'll capture at least 10%. So what does that mean for you? Well, as you start thinking about preparing, right, you want to distill your learning objectives to just one or two things. I remember several years ago I was teaching a class on Introduction to SQL, which is a programming language for the database. And this was an introductory class, so we had people who wanted to be system administrators, people who wanted to be database administrators, and the technical managers, all in that class, about 40 or 50 folks, and I had 1 hour to teach them SQL. Well, the likelihood that I was going to teach them SQL in an hour, where some people spend months or years learning, was low in and of itself. But beyond that, given that 90% of what I was going to teach was going to get lost on them, I wanted to make sure that I had one learning objective, one main point to make. And that was the main point that was going to be critical for my presentation. It's the main thing that I distilled early on when I was preparing. It's the main thing that I opened with. It's the main thing that I carried throughout my session with. And it's definitely what I ended with. And it was this: buy a good book, right? It's that simple sentence: buy a good book. Because the reality is there's going to be tons of commands in SQL that you're never going to remember. And if you have a good reference book sitting at your desk, you can look it up, right? And so what was funny was literally at the end of the conference, a guy walked up to me and said, hey, he's looking at me. He couldn't remember my name. But he's like, I'm going to buy a good book. And I knew that it had stuck. 2 years later, or a year later, we were in Denver. Mike and I were walking... I think we were heading to a comedy club, and a group of folks came up, and one of the gals looked at me and said, I remember you, buy a good book. Now we're talking about 360 to 370 days later, and she remembered this one sentence from 1 hour of I don't know, probably 20 hours of instruction that she had, but she remembered, right? And that's because you want to make sure when you're presenting that you have, that you don't have tons and tons and tons of information that you want people to totally soak in, that you don't have I want to teach you these 7 things, these 5 things, because it's likely they won't remember them all, and that it gets complicated. And what you want to do is distill it down. Now, it may not be that one sentence, it may be something else, but make sure that you are aware of the fact that the way we remember things, the way in which we process and absorb information, we need things to be repeated over and over. So once you get that, once you distill down the essence of what you want to pass on to someone else, make sure that you start with it, make sure that you repeat it multiple times, make sure you end with it, make sure that you're pounding it all the way through. You sound like a broken record. It's the way that someone gets it literally embedded in their brain so they remember it from there. So that's the first thing to remember as you're preparing your presentations coming up. There's a second thing to understand. And, if you go back, here's the thing, right? If I give you a fact, right? If I tell you what percentage of the United States is obese, or if I tell you what percentage of people go to the doctor and suffer back pain, it's just a fact. You will lose out. It'll be it'll be really easy to forget it. But if I embed it into a story, the phrase I use all the time is I wrap my facts in stories. If you can wrap a story all the way around that fact so that people are engaged in the story, and by the way, it just so happens in the middle of that story, you give them a fact, they'll remember it. For example, if I were to tell you that, hey, there's a lot of different things that have happened in the U.S. since the 3 strikes rule, where you can end up going to prison, and obviously different states have different issues with illegal immigration, and whether that has resulted in imprisonment or not is its own issue depending on how the state works, and obviously there's always crime issues. But if I told you that in the state of California that I'm concerned about the cost of education for my daughter, who obviously I'm starting to think about saving for, because this last year was the first year in the state of California where the amount of money the state gave for the UC system, the University of California system, was less than the amount the student was going to pay. So up until then, the government had always paid anywhere from $8,000 to $10,000 to $12,000 to subsidize the costs, and it literally would be slightly less than twice that for a student, etc., to get through a program per year. But this year coming up, the University of California was going to charge students $8,000, and the state was going to give it $7,000, something like that, right? And so this was the first time ever that California was going to give as a state less money than the student would give, right? Making us question, what's the whole point of a state-subsidized school system, which is part of the value we've had in this state and for the school systems for the longest time. That would be interesting to you, but here's where it'd be really interesting. What if I told you that we spend twice as much, 2 times in the state of California, twice as much on our jail system than we do in our collegiate programs? Is that a fact? Now that I've prepped all this story I've told you about, I've introduced it as an issue of crime and imprisonment and jail. I've circled back over to my daughter. I've told you about college funds and the fact that, the state has paid some portion, but it's now receding. But when I finally come down to, here's my kicker, we pay twice as much, 2 times as much for our prison system in California than we do for our collegiate system. That would be something that it would stick with you. Right? It would stick with you. And so now you'd bury it somewhere because I'd obviously set enough hooks to help you capture that data. But a year from now, if we wanted to sit down and talk about it, and I said, do you remember how, the prisons and colleges, you'd be like, oh yeah, you pay twice as much to go to prison. right? And you're like, yeah, you do. Isn't that crazy? Right? Every single story wrapped around a fact helps the fact get cemented in and locked in. But here's the other thing. When we're presenting, every single story has a beginning, middle, end, right? Now, you know the kind of story I'm talking about. It's the story that goes something like, you remember the guy, he was a little guy, he wasn't very strong, he had no friends, and he had, weird habits. Maybe he was short, maybe he was stinky, maybe he was really weak. Who knows what it was, right? He really liked bugs. Whatever it was, he was the outcast. And he ends up getting kicked out of town. He's in the outskirts of town. He has no friends. And then a dragon comes to town and starts destroying the village. And when the dragon destroys the village, everybody in the town is suffering. But this guy's on the outside of town. And it so happens that he awakens to himself some unknown reality of his giftedness, his power, his interest, the fact that he liked bugs or poisons, or that he was weak but he was really good at swimming, or whatever it was, that ultimately now, because of that skill, he's able to defeat the dragon. And then, because he defeats the dragon, he gets all excited. He goes back to the town. He defeats the dragon, and then the town welcomes him as the savior of the town, etc. Right? Every story has our introduction to the character and the character's fatal flaws or challenges. Then, literally, the larger challenge, the looming challenge that is far bigger than the fact that this character has some challenges. He is the enemy in the story and the antagonist now, who's going to defeat everything and change everything. And then we watch our protagonist climb the hill, whatever that hill is, climb the hill and cross over the top of it. And then he slides all the way down to a wonderful result. I call that the challenge, discovery, result paradigm, right? It's very simple. It's beginning, middle, end. We have a challenge. And then there's that discovery of, oh, I can actually do something about this. And they solve it. And then there's the result. Oh, everything's happy. Well, when you're presenting to people, your entire presentation ought to be that narrative. But in this story, we want to be very clear, right? The story you're telling is the story of your audience's challenge. And the fact that you understand their challenge is going to immediately connect you and them. If I sit in front of you and you all happen to be people who are programmers, and so I talk to you about the challenge and frustration of going from an object-oriented world to the way in which data is stored in a database. And the object impedance mismatch that's there that says, that, we talk about things, or we hold things in one form, but we store them in another, and it's just frustrating. You'd be like, he gets me. But if you're non-technical, you'd be like, huh? I don't know what you're talking about, right? Every single space you're in, every industry you're in, every audience you're with, they have one of those scenarios where, they know a particular pain, a particular challenge. And if you know the challenge, and you can express the challenge quickly and early in your presentation, then they say, hey, he's one of us. He's been there. He's been pushed to the outskirts of town. He's been rejected like us. He's one of us. But he has discovered something, and that's when you say, look, my job here isn't to show you how smart I am, how great I am, etc. We'll talk about that in a second. My job is just to show you the discovery I found. If I can find it, I want to show it to you so you can find it, so you can see the results that I've already seen. You're taking people through a journey, all right? I call this, and we'll talk about this literally. In fact, I'm just going to go to the next slide. Here's the thing that happens, right? When you get into a presentation, how many of you have been in any kind of corporate presentation where literally the people who are presenting to you start by telling you all about their company, right? All about their company, and you're like, we started in this year, and we have 12 Nobel laureates over here, and we do that, and you're like, when are you going to get done talking about yourselves, right? When an organization is presenting to you, you're supposed to be the hero. Now, when you're doing the presentation, your audience is the hero, not you. This isn't about you. This isn't about how smart you are. Never start a presentation. I know people will suggest this. I completely reject it. Never start a presentation with how good you are. Never start a presentation with, I've given this presentation to Fortune 500 CEOs. Of all the presentations I've given, this is the one that's most requested, and I've received a 5 out of 5, literally 98% of the time. And in the 2% that I didn't, it was because they were blind, deaf, and dumb, and so it was them, not me. Right? Never. I literally sat in front of a professional speaker's course once. You know, like he was a professional speaker, and it was a class he was giving, but on a particular topic in neuroscience, which is something I actually care about. And he was horrible. He literally spent the first 20 minutes, you know, puffing his chest and telling us about why he was the most qualified in the entire country to give this presentation and how successful this presentation had been across the country. And you're like, when do we get to the material? I don't care about you. Here's the thing. Your audience doesn't care about you. Your audience is worried about the dragon that's breathing down on their city. They don't care who you are if you have... do you remember back when you were watching Star Wars? Particularly when we get introduced to Yoda? Do you care that he's short, green, and talks funny? Luke doesn't, right? Luke doesn't care. Why? Because he's like, look, you know how to use the Force, so show me how to use the Force, because I got other things I got to go do. He's worried about his objective. Your audience is going to be worried about their objective, what they care about. And your job is to say, I know what you care about, in terms of the narrative we were just talking about. I know what you care about, and I care about it too, and I've been there, and I want to be Yoda for you. I just want to equip you. You're Luke. You're the hero of the story. I'm just here to give you some equipping. So when you present, don't start talking about yourself and your qualifications and all the things you've done. You're here to help. So be a good Yoda, right? Some of you completely do not know what I'm talking about because you never watched Star Wars. In which case, I'll simply say this. Your audience doesn't need to be distracted by your experience. Your audience needs equipping for their journey. If you can help equip them, do it. If you can give them the single thing they need to know, do it. Right? I watched recently another movie, a reference that some of you may not have seen, but it's a Percy Jackson movie, and you know, my daughter's learning about Greek mythology, and so she wanted to watch it, so we watched Percy Jackson. At one point, you know, one of his teachers at school gives him a pen and says, you need this, this is going to save you, this tool, and he's trying to give him this single pen, and the kid Percy Jackson keeps just saying, it's a pen, it's a pen, never let this out of your sight, it's a pen, to always keep this wherever you go, it's a pen, right? This is the most important thing. Now, it turns out it's not just a pen, right? Which is obviously what his teacher knew, but, you know, we can get to this point where you know, we want to talk about all these other things. If your only job is to give your audience the pen or the book or the single lesson or the key to whatever challenge or lock they have to unlock, give it to them and make it about them. Make the story their story, and you be the person who's facilitating their ability to be the hero. All right, I'll get off my soapbox and take you to step number 4, right? The fourth thing that you need to be thinking about as you prepare is this. 50% of your brain, 50% of your brain is wired for visuals. It's wired. Your brain is set to process visuals. In fact, you process visuals 60,000 times faster than any other signal that your brain could process. Do you catch that? Before you hear my words, before you can read these letters, before any of that, the picture of a brain communicates something. The color communicates something. All of that. That's why if you look at these slides, notice it's a big picture. There's not a lot of text. There's a 3. It tells me something about 3. You're going to tell me, oh, I see beginning, middle, end. I see challenge, discovery, result. But I'm prepped to understand that with a 3. Oh, here's a hero, superhero kind of guy pulling off his, you know, regular suit to see what's underneath. Every one of these slides is driven by visuals because that's what the brain processes. And it processes it so fast that people start having an emotional reaction to what they're seeing before they've heard you say a word, before they've read anything. Here's the other thing you should understand. right? You need to understand that because we process visuals so much, you shouldn't have a lot of text on your slides. Look at the size of the text here. You see how big this text is? The text is big because you don't want to give people a slide with tons and tons of text on it. And that's what most of us do. We use a default layout and we say, hey, here's something to look at, and we put 3 bullet points on the screen, and there you go. Here's how you ought to spend your time is reading. By the way, just to let you know, if you put 3 bullet points filled with text on the screen, people can read the screen faster than you can talk. So they're going to be sitting around. First of all, they're going to be distracted, right? Because you're trying to say one thing and they're reading the slide. Second of all, they're going to be, reading and done, waiting while you're still talking. The point of PowerPoint, and we'll talk about this in the next slide, but the point of PowerPoint is to visually assist your message. Many of you who come to some of my presentations have caught the fact that my slides, once I'm done talking, are useless. No one goes back to my slides later to say, hey, remind me what I was, what you're talking about. Because frankly, my slides don't tell you everything. My stories, my information, my facts are what I share with you verbally. The slides are meant to come alongside me and help me. So whatever it is you're teaching, whatever it is you're doing, when you're preparing your slides, you ought to be focused on the visuals. And when you think about visuals, by the way, one of the questions that I see that's already popped up here in the question area is Andrew's asking, where do I get my images? Well, I want to tell you about that, right? Because that's really, really important. The first place you can get images for free is at Flickr, flikr.com, and it's really flickr.com/Creative Commons. Creative Commons is a subdirectory over at Flickr, and what's going on over at Creative Commons is that everybody who has uploaded their own photos to Flickr, they get a choice about what rights they're going to use when they upload that picture, right? When they upload the picture, if they say, hey, other people can use this and create derivative works, they can put a blue coloring on my, beige brain, if I'd gotten it there, which I didn't. But if you manipulate a picture, that's called a derivative image, there is a license that lets you do that. And so the very first license at flickr.com/Creative Commons is simply the attribution license. You can do whatever you want. You just gotta point back. You gotta put a little text somewhere on the screen or in the last slide that says this image came from so-and-so, right? And what I do is I'll go there to flickr.com/Creative Commons and I'll put in a search term like board, and we'll see an image of board or passion, depending on what I'm using. And then when it gives me all the results, one of the things I want to click on is interesting. Interesting is one of their filters they use, and the way they evaluate interesting is by the number of people who've commented on the image. So it's an easy way for you to get some interesting or photos that have gravitated people towards commenting on them. So that's one place to go. You get free images. Now, they're not going to be the perfect image for you because it's someone else taking a picture of something else, but there have been some pretty good ones there, right? I found a picture there of someone in the armed forces, and he's picking up his cameraman, kind of playing, and so he's picking him up and holding him over his head, right? Like literally like pressing him like a barbell. And it's a fantastic image, except that what's going on in the background is there's a huge sandstorm that is moving behind them, and it's a wall that's like 50 to 100 feet tall, right? So you have in the front end of this picture all this joviality of we're playing, it's not that big a deal, and in the back you see total looming danger. And it's a fantastic picture for, if let's say I wanted, to make the point, focus on the right stuff, right? I would just take that picture and I'd put it up on the screen while I'm talking about focus, right? And it would make all the point in the world, right? People would giggle and they'd get it. Their brain would immediately perceive the dissonance between the danger and the playfulness and all that kind of stuff, right? But you can go to iStock Photo and pay per photo. And the last place is a place that I use called Shutterstock. And Shutterstock is really fantastic. Now, I use Shutterstock because I present at least 2 times a month, whether it's online or at speaking somewhere, and their images are fantastic, but it costs me a little over $200. Now here's what you get for $200, just to be clear. You get 30 days of downloading, and every single day you can download up to 25 images, high res, 300 DPI, really high res images, but you have to use them within 6 months. So what happens is about every 8 months, I create an account, or I use my account, I buy in for a month. For those 30 days, I have all the keywords, all the topics that I'm going to be using for my presentations, my ebooks, my PowerPoints, anything I'm going to be doing. I list all the keywords of all my kind of topics and ideas and what have you, and I go and search, and I download 25 every day for 30 days, and then I deactivate my account, right, so I don't get billed the next month. And I go about 8 months, and then I spin it up again, and I do it again. And if you use the image within the first 6 months, then you have rights to it in perpetuity after that. But you can't stockpile them, right? You can't just store them for some future day, somewhere off in Never Never Land. So a lot of different places to get images. Okay, good. Does that? Yep, that answers your question. Cool. All right. So I want to take you to our 5th point, as we're talking about how to prepare for your presentations, and that is probably the biggest factor for you. In fact, it's probably the biggest factor for just about anybody I know who presents, because more often than not, we tend to confuse PowerPoint and Word. Okay? PowerPoint is visuals that help your presentation. Think of them as mood music. Okay? PowerPoint helps you set the mood. Word is for when you create notes and explanations and takeaways, handouts that have all these details, right? So at a conference a couple years ago, I was presenting on a fairly technical topic of how to keep 2 databases in sync so that one database could be used for your regular transactional product and the other database would be used just for reporting. Now, I was presenting on it, I was talking about it, I was talking about the pains before it and why it's a good thing to think about and why we've spent so much time doing it and what we've achieved in doing it, and therefore here you can see it as a sample. And when I was done, I said, by the way, if you go to this URL, I've written a 20-page white paper on exactly, step-by-step, what to do, and you can go here and download it, and you can follow the steps on your own. But can you imagine if I had put that as the actual steps here, and I just started walking it through? And here's what's, I know some of you are laughing. I'm glad you're on mute. But you seriously, you know people like that, right? Where they'll literally for 60 minutes talk you through, here's step 1, and here's step 2, and here's step 3, thinking that an hour from now they're going to remember it. And here's the thing. 90% of what you present in an hour is going to be forgotten. So if the only 10% of what I wanted for them was, here's the URL where you can download the step-by-step file, and we did it for you because we think it's really important that you try it out so you get really high performance, right? That's it. That's all I want to get. I don't want to teach them every single step in my session, right? I want my PowerPoint slides to be visuals. Visuals, like when you first see this screen, you see a guy putting a plank over a bridge that's broken. Now, even before you process anything, your brain has already figured out solution to gap. Solution to gap. There's a gap and there needs to be a solution, the right solution for the right gap. Now, only as I start talking to you does that crystallize to, hey, PowerPoint's for one thing and Word is for another, and Word is a way to solve the gap between, the challenge you have of being visual but also sharing good information. Okay, but it's my words that help you crystallize the concept, but visually, your brain was halfway there before I started talking about this slide. Okay? You want to make sure that you're using PowerPoint effectively, right? Here's my other little tidbit on using PowerPoint effectively, and that is, you'll notice, instead of me telling you you'll notice, I want you to watch and notice it. Look at this slide. Notice where the text is, notice where the image is, right? Notice the color palette of the whole slide, etc., right? So we got one of our darker browns, we got white, we got our light blue, big image, text on top. We have the blue, the lighter blue, we have a new introduced of a darker blue, but we also have a lighter image, the lighter background. It's still brown, we're still getting tinges of that dark brown, you know, as a gradient, but we have a big image, right? And we have the number 3. Text top and text bottom. Different than when we had text just top. Text top and bottom. Now, text bottom, but in light blue, not in black, and it's over an overlay that has a bit of a transparency to it. We're back to the light blue, but now we have that dark background again, only this time it's dark with its own gradient back to light. So we see the consistency of a palette, but this slide's different than the last slide. Wait a minute. This slide's totally different than the last slide, right? We got an image again, but the text is on the left, not on the right. We got the brains colored and colored differently. This, we got the text on the background. On the bottom, it's a different color, right? But it's part of that same palette. We got the blue again. Image is on the top, but they're all bleeds, right? What are we seeing? We're seeing that as we present, we're making PowerPoint do the visual job it's meant to do. We're making PowerPoint be the visual assistance. If we had PowerPoint's default slide, it would have had text at the top, a square with bullets, and some image on the left side or some image on the bottom, because that's how PowerPoint works. Those themes are horrible. Don't use them. Use PowerPoint for what PowerPoint's supposed to be, strong visuals that aid your presentation. Does that make sense? Use them the way it's supposed to be used, to capture the visual part of the brain, 50% of the brain, that wants to and can process information faster than any other way. All right, now a couple of, we're going to get to our next piece here. A couple of times, you know, I've referenced I'm going to get off my soapbox, but a couple of times you've noticed that I've gone from talking normally to speeding up, that I've gone from talking quietly to talking louder with more emphasis. Here's the reality. If I can't get passionate about my content, why would you get passionate about my content? I mean, at the heart of it, wouldn't you expect that I should be the person most excited about my material, since I'm the one who walks around town talking about it all the time? I mean, if I'm not very excited about it, should you be even remotely excited about it? But how often do you stand in front of an audience and start talking and it sounds like you're not interested in it at all? It may be nervousness, the fact that you haven't practiced enough, or that you just don't like speaking in public, right? And so what happens? You just end up sounding disinterested. Here's what we know. Your brain is trying to figure out whether or not you should even pay attention to me. Your brain, and we'll talk about this in the next slide, but your brain is there is focused on keeping you alive. And if it realizes that this presentation is just one more boring presentation, it can check out. So imagine if I'm just talking normally, and all of a sudden I'm like, it's passion! Passion is the one thing that you gotta get right. Your brain is gonna go, holy moly, what just happened? Why do you get, even if you don't realize it, if you were looking down at your paper doodling, you will look up the moment your speaker gets louder. Why? Because your brain says, I better cue in and figure out if this is important to me. Is he about to go loony? Is he about to go crazy? Is he just excited? Well, if he's excited, what is he excited about? Passion breeds interest. Okay? So you need to be the most thrilled about your content. You need to be the one who's excited about your content. If someone else is giving you the topic and you can't get your head around it, change the topic. I know. I always get nervous when I'm talking to a whole group of people who are going to be presenting because you realize that I'm giving you feedback or information and suggestions that you may go back to, and someone will also say, no, you are not allowed to change topic. But here's the thing, find a way. Find a way to get your topic interesting to you. Because if it's not, I guarantee you your audience is not going to be engaged at all. The trick for me when I'm presenting is that I fully care about, that I'm totally committed to and completely engaged in my material. It's also the reason why I don't really need notes, right? I harp on this all the time, so you've probably heard this from me before, but the way I ask it is this. If I were to ask any of you, if I ask you to stand up now and speak for 20 minutes, almost none of you would raise your hand. If I forced one of you, if I just picked you and said, stand up now and speak for 20 minutes, you might bumble and your way through it, and ultimately it would be horrible. And that's saying nothing about you. It's just you're not prepared for it. You're not happy about it. You're not comfortable. And when you're uncomfortable, I feel the uncomfort as a listener. Here's the thing. If I asked you instead a different question, if I said, hey, you know what? We got 20 minutes. We got to burn until my computer can get plugged into the projector here and make it work. So can you just do me a favor? Would somebody just raise their hand? Would you offer to tell us your best vacation you've taken in the last year, what you did and why you liked it? You would not need notes. You would tell a pretty engaging story. You could talk for 20 minutes, and all of us would be hopefully wrapped with attention because you're telling a story about what you did, and you're doing it with communicating your own passion and interest in your own story. Here's the thing. Why are you able to stand up and talk about that without any notes for 20 minutes straight? Because you lived it. Because you knew it. Because you have memories of it, right? When you go to present information, you ought to have the passion and the interest, but also the history, the depth of knowledge, you ought to sense and have experience with it in a way that you can talk about it all day long, right? If I'm talking to a group of people about whether one of the areas of my expertise in the place where I like to spend a lot of time is building new products. I could talk to you about any of the 92 or 93 products that I've built over the last 20 years. I could talk to you about any one of them and the lessons learned, the things we did horribly wrong, and the things we figured out after the fact. And the number of people who made tons of money writing books about things we learned before they learned it, and yet we never thought to sit down and write about it. But I could tell you all sorts of crazy stories about how we screwed up in building new products and finally got a product to market. And I could do it without notes, because new product development is something I'm passionate about. You need to find a way to channel your passion when it comes to the topics that you're presenting, because then you'll also be able to do it without notes. And as you do it without notes, as you get better and better, I mean, I'm not saying you can't have a note card or a handful of note cards, but if you're up there reading, I can guarantee you're going to have your audience looking like this guy. All right? Let's move to number 7 in our list. Now, here's the research they did at Stanford. They took a whole bunch of students at Stanford. These were students who were good and smart students. These were people that they paid a little bit of money. And what they did was they rattled off a bunch of numbers to these kids, right? 1, 17, 32, 4, 2, 12, 16, 38, 47, 52, 3. And then they said, okay, would you write down all the numbers you remember me saying? And so they wrote the numbers down. And then they asked people, okay, how many of you had this number? How many of you had this number? And when they were done, listing it out, what was really interesting was the number of people that had the first couple numbers and the last couple numbers were really, really high. And no one in the room had the middle number, right? Now, why is that? That's because the way our brain works, right? The way your brain works goes something like this. When you first hear someone starting to speak, you pay attention because your brain is trying to figure out, is this person a threat to me? Is this person going to offer me or give me something that is really great for me? What's going on here? Once you discover that this person is a bore, or that there's nothing of interest here, or there's nothing of threat here, the brain checks out. And it checks out on purpose because it's like, this is a good time to take a break and rest. And then, as I start getting close to my end, I use little words like, hey, the last thing I want to tell you is, or, here's the final thing, or we got just 4 more minutes left, and in these last few minutes, I want to, any of those phrases, your brain catches faster than you even know, and it starts paying attention again. Because it says, okay, he's wrapping up. What's going to happen next? Right? There's a great video, and I'll get you the link to it. There's a great video on YouTube, also done at Stanford, where they put a person in an fMRI chamber to scan their brain. And what an fMRI system is doing is just like a regular MRI, but it's on your brain. It's not intrusive, but they're monitoring the magnetic difference between oxygenated and deoxygenated blood, where essentially, part of your brain is consuming that oxygen for energy. And so it looks at where your brain is needing or leveraging energy while you're doing something. And so they play classical music, and they're monitoring this brain inside an fMRI while the music's playing. And here's what's great. While the music's playing, the brain is doing absolutely nothing. Brain's just like, yeah, whatever. I caught this and I'm done. But as it starts getting quieter, as the movement comes to an end, the brain starts firing up. It's as if the brain is going, getting quiet. I think this is going to end. Okay, I better start looking up. I better start paying attention. What's next? What's next? Then, because the movement's done and there's a small break, and then the music starts again, the music does start, and the brain starts checking out almost immediately again. It goes, oh, it's just more of the same. And then no more lights on anywhere in the brain. It just checks out, right? The brain is meant, the way it works, it's meant to protect you, it's meant to keep you safe, it's meant to pay attention. But if all you see is a guy at the front of the room just going on and on, talking, your brain checks out. There's nothing here to see. Just another boring presentation, right? And so, as a presenter, that's why you need to create interrupts. You need to create as many starts and stops as possible. You'll notice I have this way of talking where I'll start something and I'll interrupt myself and I'll go a different direction. And what I want to do is in this next point, or actually I'll get to that in the next slide, but first I want to do this. And some people can say, oh, that's a little bit annoying, but I'm doing it. I've learned to do it as a habit because it messes with your brain, right? It triggers your brain. It says, oh, that's what's next, but wait, now here's this, but we're going to go over there, and your brain's going, wait, okay, hold on. Are we starting something else? Is there a new part? You'll notice that, now, this is a little more difficult because you're on mute, and so I can't say, like I normally do, every 2 to 3 slides, I might say, does that make sense? And get you to verbally communicate. It's creating an interrupt. It's creating a stopping moment, right? And because I'm, as many starts and stops that I can create, I know I can re-engage your brain all over again, right? So I know that you pay more attention at the beginning and end of anything, and in the middle, you don't. So if I start a presentation and talk monotone, literally for an entire presentation, and then you'll remember slide 1, you'll remember slide 10 or 11. That's it. But if I can, break it up into little chunks, create natural divisions, then you will pay attention at the start and stop of each of those little divisions. Hopefully that makes sense. And we're going to come on a division right now, right? Because, oh, by the way, I told you I wanted to show you that that link. I wanted to get you that link of the brain inside of an fMRI chamber during the listening of classical music. So that is the URL that you're going to want to click to and go see. But at this point, you're probably going, hold on a second, just wait a minute. You've given me all sorts of high-level, tons of strategic things I need to be paying attention to, all of which makes my brain hurt. But at the same time, you haven't told me anything about how to use PowerPoint itself. So I thought this was going to be on how to get my slides ready, and all you're doing is telling me how to present better, but it sounds like a lot of work. I'm not sure this has been good for me. Can we get practical? Well, just now what I did was I created a little mini stop, right? Notice that back over here, we had been going through the 10 things you need to know, and we had the little 7. Now we don't have the number, now we don't have the number, and now I'm going to take you into 3 practical tips. You're going to see the numbers again, right? That's a stop and a start. And when I say, hey, wait a minute, your brain automatically goes, well, something's different, and looks up again. I create a new start for you. But what I want to do is walk you through 3 really practical steps, just as we get ready to wrap up here. And the first is, I want you to learn how to use font controls, right? Now, it depends on if you're using a Mac or PC where those will be, but the font controls allow you to make the text tighter and the line spacing smaller. And that's a really important thing. In most cases, you're going to have to go up to something like format text or format paragraph, and then you'll get the, how to condense or expand your text. But you'll notice when you see can make the text tighter, this looks close. It connects. It's stronger because it's close. When it's spread apart, it's a weaker statement, right? Also, when it's close together, it says these are related. If you take a look up here, right, at our slide, Passion Breeds Interest, if this were actually set up the way it was initially intended to, the text would have been wider, not very close together, and much spaced out much more in terms of line spacing, and it would not have been tight and packed a powerful punch. And that's not a good thing. So learn how to use the font controls to your advantage. If all you did in your slides was to make your text tighter and get the spacing brought down, you'd be in a great spot. And when we talk about fonts, I want to give you a little rule of thumb. I know some of you have heard me talk about this already. It's a rule of thumb as it relates to the font size that you should be using. You'll notice most of my slides have fonts that are pretty big. And you don't have to go as big as I do, but you need to have a good sized font. And so the easy way to do it is take the oldest person in the room, divide their age by half, and that's the smallest font you should have on your slide. So if you're presenting to 18-year-olds, then go ahead and have 9-point font. But if you're not, if you're presenting to people that might be 50 or 60 in the audience, you need to get that font size minimum up to 30 points. Okay? Now, that's all about fonts. What I now want to show you is just the same way you need to learn how to use format font or format paragraph or what have you. I want you to learn how to do format picture. Here's what happens most of the time when we create a PowerPoint presentation. We just grab some image, and please, whatever you do not use clip art, right? Unless it's the perfect image, an illustration, perfect twist or turn or icon that you need that makes the most sense. Don't just go into Microsoft's random clip art just to shove something on the screen, right? It's really ridiculous. You're better off just using fonts with no image. But when you go to use an image, if you take an image and you put it, what happens is you naturally drop it on the page. It shows up like this. It's small. You can go in and use the controls to put a boundary over it and give it a little shadow. When you do that, what you're really saying is this concept, whatever it represents, it's smaller than life. It's bounded. It's not that big a concept, right? It's not as big as this page, and it has a nice solid boundary around it, keeping it in check. But when you have items that are critical or larger than life, you want them to fall off the page. That's what we call bleeds. And you want that image to fall off the page, and that means, and you'll notice, right? We don't get all of her in here. Even her head at the top is cut off. Here, he's so big, he can't fit on the full page. Could I move him to the middle? Yeah, it would have been visually boring. But also, I wanted to communicate, right now you're not paying attention. This problem's larger than life, and I'm having him bleed off the edge, right? So when you set yourself, your visuals up, use the format picture options to get what you need. Crop it the right way you want, place it in the right spot, manage your bleeds. You'll also notice, and you can see, because I was moving quickly, this tiny tinge of white around some of the edges. but I can take the background off this, right? Even if it comes with a white background, I don't need to leave it there. I can take it off and create my image on my own background that I have as part of my slides. And so now we get to the last part, and that is what I told you at the beginning, and I want to end at the end. And it's that from the moment you start speaking, people will start forgetting. It's really that's the way it works. But I want to tell you about an interesting study they did that is just, it's incredible. And you know, bear with me as I start the story, because you're gonna initially go, ooh, why is he talking about this? But it's literally 2 patients who go in for colonoscopies. Okay, now I don't know if you know exactly what a colonoscopy is, but I'm assuming that you can imagine, just by me saying colonoscopy, that what we're talking about is something that is going to be uncomfortable and painful for some amount of time. And patient A had a 9-minute colonoscopy, and patient B had a 20-minute colonoscopy. Patient B clearly had a longer event. On top of that, every minute in the 9 minutes or 20 minutes, the patient was asked, what's your pain level? Pain of 0 is absolutely no pain. Pain of 10 is the most excruciating pain I've ever felt in my entire life. And what you see for patient A is that the patient starts obviously down at 0 or 1 and moves slowly up until you get to about the 7th minute, when it jumps up to a pain level of 8. But in the last minute or so, it drops from an 8 down to a 7, but that's about it. So it waits till the end, it shoots up, and then the procedure ends. And it ends with a pain threshold pretty high. Patient B, on the other hand, has 20 minutes to experience this joy. And over the 20 minutes, it starts off similarly pretty low. It waits a little more than 6 or 7 minutes, but finally it kicks up to the same level of 7 or 8, and it gets up to 8, and it holds 8 longer than patient A. But then it starts coming down, and it slowly ends down around a 2 or a 3. Now here's where it gets interesting. At the end, after it's all done, they pull patient A and B aside, and they ask them, how would you rate the overall experience? And here's where it's really interesting. Patient A says it was a 7. Now, he only had it for 9 minutes, and his maximum point was 8. He ended at a 7. But for someone who had a shorter process, he says it was painful. It was about a 7. And yet patient B says, oh, it was about a 3 or 4. Even though patient B had the process take twice as long or longer and had carried a threshold pain of 8 longer than the other patient, but was able to come down off the end and in a different way. And what this says is the way in which our brains work, our brains actually process and perceive information at the time it's happening, like everyone else. Our brains process that, but that's not how it gets stored. The brain doesn't store every instance of every day. We are not computers. When the data gets past the amygdala in the brain, where it's going to flow through to create memories, it's going to create memories in a very different way. It's going to be a shell, a tiny virtual compressed notion or image from the entire experience, and it's not going to be technically perfect. It's not going to be technically accurate. It's going to literally be managed by 1 or 2 things. In the case of an experience, it's the high point or highest point, the apex of the experience, whether that is joy or pain, and how it ends. Those are the 2 factors for how well something, is experienced, is the apex and the level at which it ends. And so if you, if you're having a colonoscopy, if it ends at a 7, you're likely to think it was a 7. And if it ends down at a 1 or 2, you're likely to think it might have been a 3 or 4, especially if at the apex it was still an 8. Apex and end. These are the things that people care about. So when you present your material, make sure you end well. Make sure that you wrap up with your main point. If you have one thing that I want you to remember, it's that 90% of the material you present is not going to be remembered, which means put it into a handout so they can get it and use it later. And just make sure they remember the one thing that you want them to learn. And that is that 90% of the material that you present is going to be lost, right? So focus on the one thing you got to shape, which is that people are going to forget from the moment you start talking. You see what I'm doing? I just keep pounding this thing until you're like, I get what you're saying. I got to distill it down to one thing. I can't say here are the 17 things you need to take away from my presentation. So you need to make sure that at the best part of your presentation, you're really good, and that you end well. End strongly. End with the main point, right? End making sure that you're telling them, look, you're Luke. You're the hero of the story. You're the protagonist. I'm Yoda. Be a good Yoda. Here's the key that you need to use the Force, Luke. Use the Force. Just get the main point out there and be the one who equips. And when you do that well, when you remember these 10 things as you start preparing your presentations for your audience, I think you will have incredible success. All of this framework comes down to a framework I use called Sticky Teaching. It's one that I crafted, and literally over 20,000 people have viewed my infographic on this material over at slideshare.net. You can get this version of a poster. You know, the infographic is a really tall, skinny, long one. But you can get this version of a poster, which is a PDF, at my website, chrissummon.com, and you can pull it down so that you remind yourself over and over. Make sure there's a little mystery in what you're talking about. Make sure you have starts and stops, those interrupts we were talking about. Create contrast in your voice, the pace at which you speak and the volume. Use stories. Make sure you're passionate and focus on one main thing. This is A, B, C, D, E, and F. These are the 6 things to get right to make sure that you keep someone's attention. And you'll see other pieces, right? The 50% of your brain that processes visual information 60,000 times faster than we process text, 90% of what we learn. So all of the stuff that I've just told you about, you can find and keep in this one PDF that is available online. So with that, what I'm going to do is wrap up this recording, and then we'll take ourselves over to our time for questions. Thanks.